There's a mathematical sequence that has destroyed every global superpower for the last 500 years. Not a theory, not a prediction, a documented pattern that plays out with mechanical precision. Spain dominated the world in the 1500s, controlled more gold and silver than any empire in history, and within 80 years they were bankrupt and irrelevant. Britain ruled a quarter of the planet in 1900. The sun never set on their territory, and by 1950 the empire was gone. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons and global influence spanning 6 continents, and it ceased to exist in 900 days. 3 superpowers, 3 different centuries, 3 identical collapses following the exact same 7-stage breakdown sequence. And here's what should keep you awake at night. The United States has already completed 5 of those 7 stages. We're not approaching this pattern, we're deep inside it. The debt crisis, the military overextension, the currency manipulation, the social breakdown. It's all happening right now following the same script that led to catastrophe every single time before. This isn't about politics or ideology, this is about mathematics and historical precedent. When a nation reaches stage 5 of this sequence, stages 6 and 7 follow with brutal inevitability. The pattern doesn't care about American exceptionalism. It doesn't care that we're different or special or too big to fail. Spain thought they were invincible because they controlled the money supply of Europe. Britain thought they were permanent because they ruled the seas. The Soviet Union thought they were the future because they had nuclear weapons. They were all wrong, and they all collapsed following identical steps in identical order. The sequence is locked in, the timeline is visible, and the math says we're next. Let me show you exactly how this breakdown works, why governments never see it coming, and where America stands in the cycle right now. Because once you understand the pattern, you'll see it everywhere. You'll see it in the Congressional Budget Office reports that show we're spending more on debt interest than on defense for the first time in American history. You'll see it in the military commitments that span 150 countries while our infrastructure crumbles at home. You'll see it in the social trust surveys that show faith in institutions at all-time lows. The warning signs aren't subtle, they're screaming. But before we dive into where America stands today, you need to understand what superpower collapse actually looks like. Not the textbook version, the reality. Imperial breakdown doesn't start with foreign invasion or military defeat. It starts with economic exhaustion, with a nation extending beyond its ability to sustain itself. The empire promises more than it can deliver, borrows more than it can repay, and commits to more than it can defend. At first, the decline is invisible because the mechanisms of power still function. The currency still works, the military still wins battles, the government still makes promises. But underneath, the foundation is rotting. Resources get misallocated on a massive scale. Instead of productive investment, money flows to consumption, to maintaining appearances, to servicing debt that grows faster than the economy. The best minds start leaving for places with better opportunities. Innovation stagnates because why build when you can borrow? The productive sectors get hollowed out while the financial sector expands to manage the debt pyramid. Then comes the acceleration phase, where decades of decline compress into years of crisis. Allies begin hedging their bets because they see the writing on the wall. Enemies test boundaries because they sense weakness. Trade partners seek alternatives because they question long-term stability. The reserve currency status that once provided unlimited borrowing power becomes a liability as foreign holders dump the currency back into domestic markets. Military bases that once projected strength become unsustainable drains on resources. International commitments that once demonstrated leadership become impossible. Promises that destroy credibility. This is exactly what happened to Spain starting in 1580. Philip II had the largest empire in human history, controlled the flow of precious metals from the Americas, and commanded armies across 4 continents. But the cost was staggering. Half of Spain's revenue went to military expenditures, and it still wasn't enough to maintain their commitments. So they did what every failing empire does, they debased their currency. Spanish coins that were supposed to be pure silver became 50% copper, then 75% copper. The face value stayed the same, but merchants stopped accepting them at full value. The debt spiral followed immediately. Spain declared bankruptcy in 1557, just 20 years into Philip's reign. Then again in 1560, 1575, and 1596. 4 bankruptcies in 40 years, each time promising reforms, each time going right back to borrowing and spending. But here's the part that destroys empires. They lost their productive capacity. When you control unlimited money, you stop making things. Why grow food when you can import it? Why build ships when you can buy them? Spanish nobility considered work beneath them. Manufacturing declined, agriculture stagnated, and all the wealth flowed to importing goods from other countries. Spain became a conduit where precious metals from the Americas went straight back out to pay for French wine, Italian silk, and Dutch manufactured goods. They weren't producing anything, they were just moving money around. When the silver mines began depleting and production dropped, the entire system collapsed. By 1640, Spain lost Portugal. By 1650, they lost the Netherlands. And by 1700, the Spanish Empire was economically dead. They went from global superpower to regional European country in less than a century and never recovered. Britain followed the identical pattern 3 centuries later. At their peak in 1900, they controlled 25% of the world's land surface and 400 million subjects. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. Every major trade contract was denominated in pounds. Every central bank held British bonds. London was the financial centre of the world, and just like Spain before them, they believed it was permanent. But they were already deep into the breakdown sequence. World War I exposed the underlying weakness. Britain faced a choice between staying neutral and letting Europe destroy itself, or jumping in and bankrupting the empire to win. They chose to fight, and the war cost them over $40 billion in 1918 money. That's more than $1 trillion in today's purchasing power. They borrowed from everyone, mostly from the United States, and by 1918 Britain owed America billions. The creditor had become the debtor, but they thought they could rebuild because they'd kept the empire. The currency debasement came next. The pound was supposed to be backed by gold, but the war had drained Britain's gold reserves. They'd shipped gold to America to pay for weapons, food, and supplies. By 1920, Britain's gold reserves were half what they had been in 1914, but they tried to maintain the pound's value anyway. They went back on the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate in 1925, even though the pound was massively overvalued. British exports became too expensive, manufacturing declined, unemployment rose, and the government had to keep interest rates high to defend the currency. This destroyed the domestic economy, and by 1931 they couldn't hold the peg anymore. Britain abandoned the gold standard and the pound lost 25% of its value overnight. The global reserve currency had just admitted it couldn't keep its promises, and confidence never recovered. World War II finished the job with another $120 billion in costs and more, borrowing from America. By 1945, Britain owed more than their entire GDP to the United States and Canada combined. The empire unravelled with stunning speed. In 1947, they gave up India, the crown jewel that had been the source of wealth for 200 years. Over the next 20 years, they lost everything else. Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, all of it gone by 1970. The empire that once spanned the globe existed only in history books, and the pound kept falling. From $4 per pound in 1940 to $2.80 in 1950 to $2.40 in 1970. Today it's worth about $1.20. The global reserve currency became a regional currency, and Britain became America's junior partner. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 provides the most recent and dramatic example of how quickly a superpower can disintegrate once the breakdown sequence reaches its final stages. The USSR emerged from World War II as a nuclear-armed giant, controlling Eastern Europe and projecting power across 6 continents. They had massive military forces, space technology, global influence, and an ideology that promised to bury capitalism. For 45 years they matched American power, built more tanks, deployed more missiles, supported more proxy wars. But beneath the impressive military facade, the economy was dying from the same structural problems that had destroyed Spain and Britain. Military overextension consumed everything. The Soviet Union spent 15 to 20% of GDP on defense, triple what America spent during the Cold War. They had to match American technology and global reach with an economy a fraction of the size. They were fighting in Afghanistan, propping up Cuba, supporting Syria and Vietnam and North Korea and Angola and Ethiopia. Everywhere America had influence, they had to counter it. The cost was mathematically unsustainable, but they kept spending because admitting weakness would have meant admitting the system had failed. The economic stagnation was terminal. Soviet factories produced junk that nobody wanted to buy. Farms failed so badly that a country with some of the best agricultural land on Earth had to import grain to feed its people. Technology fell decades behind the West because central planning kills innovation. When bureaucrats control every economic decision, when there's no profit motive, when failure has no consequences, nothing works. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy had stopped growing entirely, surviving only on oil revenue that was about to disappear. Oil prices crashed in the mid-1980s, and the Soviet Union lost its primary source of hard currency. They were running out of gold reserves, couldn't borrow internationally because the ruble was worthless, and faced the choice between economic reform or military retrenchment. They chose reform under Mikhail Gorbachev, but reform in a communist system is like pulling one thread from a sweater. Everything unravels. Glasnost and perestroika didn't fix the economy, they exposed how broken everything had become. The empire started fragmenting in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell and Eastern Europe walked away. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, East Germany, all gone within a year. The satellites that had given the Soviet Union strategic depth and global reach simply declared independence, and Moscow couldn't stop them because they were bankrupt. The government couldn't pay the military, couldn't maintain control, couldn't even keep the lights on in government buildings. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. 900 days from the fall of the Berlin Wall to complete dissolution. No war, no invasion, just economic implosion. A superpower with 30,000 nuclear weapons collapsed because it couldn't pay its bills. The pattern had played out again. Military overextension, currency failure, economic stagnation, loss of empire, total collapse. And every step followed the same sequence that had destroyed Spain and Britain before. Now let's examine where the United States stands in this 7-stage breakdown cycle, because the parallels are impossible to ignore. We've completed Stage 1 military overextension beyond any rational measure. America maintains over 750 military bases in 80 countries, with troops deployed in 150 nations. We're committed to defending Europe through NATO, defending Japan and South Korea and the Philippines and Taiwan, fighting in the Middle East, countering China in the Pacific, countering Russia in Europe. Our military budget exceeds $850 billion annually, more than the next 10 countries combined. But here's the critical point. We're stretched impossibly thin. Our equipment is aging, recruitment is down, and we have commitments we simply cannot fulfill simultaneously. If China invades Taiwan while Russia pushes into NATO territory, while Iran closes the Persian Gulf, we cannot respond effectively to all three crises. We've made promises our military cannot keep, exactly like Spain promising to defend territories across 4 continents, exactly like Britain trying to police a quarter of the planet, exactly like the Soviet Union attempting to match American global reach with inferior resources. Stage 2 currency debasement is already well advanced. Since 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, the dollar has been pure fiat currency backed by nothing except government promises. We've printed money at unprecedented rates, especially since 2008 and again during the pandemic response. The money supply has increased 400% since 2000. We're not mixing copper into silver coins like Spain did. We're creating trillions of digital dollars out of thin air. The mechanism is different, but the result is identical systematic devaluation of the currency to fund government spending. Stage 3 debt spiral is accelerating beyond control. The United States owes $37 trillion. That's 120% of GDP. Interest payments alone approach $1 trillion annually. More than we spend on defense, more than we spend on education, approaching the cost of social security. We run massive deficits every year, borrowing money to pay interest on previous borrowing, which is the textbook definition of a debt spiral. We're following the exact same path as Spain declaring bankruptcy 4 times in 40 years, as Britain borrowing until the empire collapsed, as the Soviet Union running out of money to pay for basic government functions. Stage 4, loss of productive capacity, is devastating our economic foundation. America doesn't manufacture the products we consume anymore. We design and finance and market, but we don't produce. Our manufacturing base has been systematically dismantled and shipped overseas. We import $800 billion more than we export every year, meaning we're dependent on foreign supply chains for everything from medicine to electronics to military components. Just like Spain became dependent on imports while precious metals flowed out, We're dependent on foreign production while dollars flow out to pay for goods we no longer make ourselves. This isn't just about economics, it's about national security. When you can't produce your own medicine, your own computer chips, your own steel, you're vulnerable in ways that previous generations would have found incomprehensible. We've traded short-term consumer benefits for long-term strategic weakness, and the consequences are becoming visible as supply chain disruptions reveal how dependent we've become on potentially hostile nations for essential goods. Stage 5, social decay, is unmistakable across every metric that matters. Trust in institutions has collapsed to historic lows. Congress has 15% approval ratings. Trust in media is at rock bottom. Half the country believes elections are rigged regardless of who wins. Political polarization has reached levels not seen since the Civil War, with each side viewing the other as an existential threat rather than fellow citizens with different opinions. Infrastructure is crumbling. Homelessness is exploding. Drug overdoses kill over 100,000 Americans annually. The social fabric that holds nations together is unraveling in real time. Fertility rates have collapsed below replacement level, meaning we're not even reproducing enough to maintain current population levels. Young people can't afford homes, can't start families, can't achieve the basic milestones of adult life that previous generations took for granted. The American dream has become mathematically impossible for millions of citizens, and when people lose faith in the system's ability to deliver prosperity, they start looking for alternatives outside the system. We're witnessing the emergence of Stage 6, loss of reserve currency status, as international confidence in dollar dominance begins to fracture. The BRICS nations are actively developing alternative payment systems to bypass the dollar-based international banking network. China and Russia are conducting bilateral trade in yuan and rubles, deliberately excluding American currency from their transactions. Saudi Arabia, America's longtime ally, has begun accepting yuan for oil payments, breaking the petrodollar arrangement that has underpinned American monetary hegemony since the 1970s. Central banks worldwide are diversifying away from dollar reserves at the fastest pace in decades. They're buying gold at record levels, accumulating over 2,000 tons annually, the highest rate since 1950. Why? Because they see what's coming. They're preparing for a world where the dollar is just another currency, not the global reserve currency that provides America with unlimited borrowing power. When foreign nations stop needing dollars for international trade, those trillions of dollars held overseas come flooding back home, creating inflation that makes the 1970s look mild. This isn't theoretical anymore. The infrastructure for dollar alternatives is being built right now. China's Belt and Road Initiative creates trade relationships that bypass American financial systems. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization facilitates commerce in local currencies. European nations are developing payment systems independent of SWIFT, the American-controlled banking network. Even American allies are hedging their bets because they question whether dollar dominance is sustainable when America owes $37 trillion and adds $2 trillion more debt every year. The pattern shows that once allies start seeking alternatives, the reserve currency privilege disappears rapidly. Britain maintained sterling's reserve status for decades after their economic decline began, but when confidence finally broke in the 1930s, it collapsed within a few years. The Soviet ruble was never truly international, but when communist satellite states started using hard currency instead of rubles for trade, it signaled the end of Soviet economic influence. The dollar's reserve status has lasted longer than historical precedent suggests it should, but that just means the eventual adjustment will be more severe. Stage 7 represents complete systemic breakdown, and the timeline for this phase is always much faster than anyone expects. Spain took 80 years to decline from peak to irrelevance, but the final collapse happened in just 2 decades. Britain maintained global influence for 50 years after their economic peak, but the empire disintegrated in 20 years. The Soviet Union seemed permanent until 1987, then vanished in 4 years. The breakdown phase accelerates because confidence collapses faster than economic fundamentals deteriorate. Here's what Stage 7 looks like when it arrives. The federal government faces a choice between defaulting on debt or printing money to pay obligations. Default destroys credibility permanently and triggers immediate economic chaos. Money printing destroys the currency and triggers hyperinflation that wipes out savings and fixed incomes. Either choice leads to the same outcome: loss of international confidence and domestic political breakdown. The dollar's value collapses in international markets, imports become unaffordable, supply chains break down, and basic goods become scarce. Domestic political institutions fracture under the pressure. States begin ignoring federal authority, either refusing to send tax revenue to Washington or declaring independence from federal mandates they can no longer afford to implement. The military faces impossible choices between supporting a bankrupt federal government or maintaining loyalty to state and local authorities who can actually pay salaries. Civil order breaks down in major cities as economic collapse triggers social unrest that overwhelmed police forces cannot contain. This isn't science fiction, it's historical precedent. Every empire that has followed this 7-stage sequence has experienced rapid disintegration once Stage 7 begins. The Soviet Union went from superpower to non-existent in less than 3 years. Yugoslavia broke apart in a decade of wars that killed hundreds of thousands. Even peaceful dissolutions like Czechoslovakia happened within months once the process started. Large political entities become unstable very quickly when the economic foundation disappears. The American situation is actually more precarious than previous empires because our society is more complex and interdependent. When Rome collapsed, most people were subsistence farmers who could survive without complex supply chains. When Britain lost its empire, they retained a functioning domestic economy that could feed and house the population. When the Soviet Union disintegrated, the successor states had natural resources and agricultural land to sustain themselves. America has none of these advantages. We've created a just-in-time economy where grocery stores have 3 days of food, where electronic systems control everything from power grids to water treatment plants, where most Americans lack the skills to produce basic necessities. Our population is concentrated in massive urban areas that depend entirely on complex logistics networks for survival. When those networks break down, as they inevitably do during currency collapses, the social consequences are catastrophic. The federal government understands this vulnerability, which is why they're preparing for scenarios most Americans can't imagine. Continuity of government plans, military exercises for domestic unrest, surveillance systems that monitor every communication, detention facilities that can hold millions of people. They're not preparing for foreign invasion, they're preparing for domestic breakdown. They know the math as well as anyone, and they know what happens when 37 trillion in debt meets a collapsing currency, meets a population that expects government services to continue forever. Foreign powers are positioning themselves to exploit American weakness when Stage 7 arrives. China has been buying gold, developing alternative currency systems, and building military capabilities specifically designed to challenge American power projection. Russia has been reducing dollar holdings, strengthening regional alliances, and testing American responses to territorial aggression. Iran has been developing nuclear capabilities and missile technology, while building relationships with anti-American nations across the Middle East. These nations aren't waiting for American collapse, they're actively accelerating it. Economic warfare through currency manipulation, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, information warfare designed to increase domestic political polarization, support for proxy forces that drain American military resources. They understand that defeating America militarily is unnecessary when economic pressure can trigger internal collapse. Why fight the American military when you can bankrupt the American government? The timeline for Stage 7 is impossible to predict precisely, but the accelerating indicators suggest we're approaching the point of no return. Debt growth is exponential, interest payments are consuming an ever larger share of government revenue, social trust is collapsing faster than institutions can adapt, and international alternatives to dollar dominance are becoming operational. The Soviet Union looked stable until 1987, then disappeared in 1991. The timeline from apparent strength to complete collapse is always shorter than experts predict. 3 empires, 1 pattern, 500 years of identical breakdowns. Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union, all followed the same 7 stages from dominance to collapse. America has completed 5 stages and is showing early signs of Stage 6. The debt is mathematically unpayable, the military is impossibly overextended, the currency is systematically debased, productive capacity is gone, social trust has collapsed, and international alternatives are being built right now. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with brutal precision. The pattern says stages 6 and 7 are inevitable, the only question is timing. Maybe we can break the cycle, maybe American exceptionalism will prove different this time. But the math says otherwise, the precedent says otherwise, and the warning signs are screaming. If this opened your eyes to where we actually stand in the sequence, Share this with everyone you know because when Stage 7 hits, it happens faster than anyone expects.